Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a empezar ahora esta sesión híbrida, esta charla con Cassidy Sugimoto de la Universidad de Atlanta, de Georgia Tech, y Vincent Larivière de la Universidad de Montreal. Ellos están aquí esta semana porque están ligados a la Universidad de Granada a través del programa de Visiting Scholars de la Universidad de Granada. Y bueno, pues van a presentarnos un libro que acaban de publicar recientemente sobre igualdad en ciencia, sobre género e igualdad en la ciencia, ¿vale? Y bueno, ya han estado trabajando durante 2 años, han estado viniendo aquí a la Universidad de Granada en los 2 últimos años de manera anual y estamos trabajando también con ellos y colaborando en diversas tareas. Y dentro de su programa de este proyecto, pues tiene una parte de formación también y de divulgación de las cosas que están haciendo y tal. Y bueno, hemos aprovechado esta plataforma para que puedan dar a conocer pues, el trabajo que están haciendo. Voy a compartir pantalla ya para que empecemos y le voy a dar la palabra a Vincent, ¿no? You can start. Yeah, I'm gonna start. La presentación, por si alguien está dispuesto a tal, será todo en inglés, ¿vale? Y como siempre hacemos, pues luego damos un periodo de preguntas y tal. Así que ya give you the word. Perfect. Yeah. Gracias.
So thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm gonna start the talk, and Cassidy is gonna make the fun part at the end. So we'll basically go through most of the results of our book that was published a couple of months ago, which has basically how many chapters? Yeah, seven chapters that actually look at various aspects of the gender gap in science. So I'm going to go over the gap reduction, collaboration, contributorship, and then Cassidy is going to discuss funding, mobility, scientific impact, social institution, and then go through some of the recommendations that we basically draw from the results that we've obtained. But before delving into that, I just want to say a couple of words on the methods that we've used to do to write the book. So most of the book is based on bibliometric data, which I believe most of you are basically developed a gender assignment, which is 12, and it got published in 2013, and we've improved upon it. There's one thing that I know about this algorithm is that it doesn't work at the same level for every country. So basically, it's an algorithm that's based on the given names of authors, and in some countries on their family names. So for the case of Russia and Ukraine, for instance, the family names are gendered, which explains why the proportion of names that we're able to assign a gender to is actually fairly high. So the precision and recall for those countries is actually quite amazing. For North America, it goes pretty well. You may notice quite a huge north-south divide there. So proportion of names that we're able to assign a gender to is much closer to 1 out of 2 for most countries in Africa and in South America. That's a sizable limitation. The assumption that we're making here is that the name that we're able to assign a gender to are basically behaving in a similar manner than the names that we're unable to assign a gender to. And we did quite a lot of spot checks and basically, and I would say more than spot check, manual validations of thousands of names. And basically the gender distribution of unknowns was very similar to the gender distribution of the names we're able to assign a gender to. So kind of validates the methodology, but then for some countries it may be a bit weaker. So that's kind of a important limitation of the one up front. Basing it of science, so 2008 to 2020, the reason why time where they try to index both the given names of authors as well as the link between an author and their affiliation, which allows us to say, okay, this is Kim in the US, that's likely a woman. This is Kim in Finland, that's likely a man. So we have no choice but to do the national. From a field and scientific point of view, we'll mostly look at some of the which would be so to there's a very nice quote that we like here, which is not all tools of oppression. We can also use them, and so in some level is actually quite important to understand and reveal inequality exists. So the first chapter and the first in research production and research and participation into research activities, of course, is based on authorship. Fine. Yeah. Okay. Good. I just want to make sure I have something here. So basically, authorship is a crucial key thing in the scientific community. Authorship does two things mostly. It attributes the credit for a discovery, so it gives you scientific capital. It's at the heart of the economy of your, but it also assigns a responsibility for research fee. So it's really the two facets of the authorship coin. It's something that is actually crucial to understand who can contribute and who can participate into scientific activities. So at the world level, what do we see? I am happy, I'm not really happy, but like all of the countries that are in orange, the country where there's gender parity. So you can look for a while, you're going to find that there's basically only a few. One of them is Latvia, which is, well, you know where it is. So when the Baltic countries. Latvia has above 50% of women authorship. Many Eastern European countries are what we could say in the parity zone. Argentina is actually also in the parity zone. Most of the Middle Eastern and the there's a gap. And so we look at countries that have gender parity. Why does Latvia actually have parity? We ran a couple of regressions with a lot of world data, trying to see are there economic indicators from that gender equality. And the fact was the strongest was male mortality. So basically, these countries have more women in their scientific system because men are dead. So we thought about implementing a policy like that in Canada, but it did not get much support. But basically, that's the main driver. And the other driver, which is corollary, is actually proportion of women in the work in general. So of course, scientific workforce is part of the general workforce. So these countries also have a higher proportion of women. Of Latvia, for instance, the gender gap in life expectancy is about 10 years. Women die at roughly 67. So there's much where there's gender equality. That academic actually not very poorly paid, not very well paid. So it's not a place where women is actually a these vary a lot by discipline and specialties. What you see here, every specialty. Of course, in health sciences, globally, there's a higher proportion of women, and in a field like nursing, one could say it's the opposite. 5% of authorships that are from women. Overall, much higher, and development tells you which is more quantitative. And in professional fields, it's not surprising to see management being actually really low in education for work at a high proportion. There's no surprise, I would say, from what we know about science and science regarding those results. In humanity, In the future, it's going to be amazing. But in the past,
that's it. Uh, right. And the sharing is not happening either. Argentina. Okay, now it seems to be doing something. Yeah. No. I see it there, but not here.
yeah. Actually, it's as if we need to share that screen.
Oh, well, here you have it. So there you go. So you can.
Yeah. Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
We don't want them to see what's
Right.
That's cool. Guys, not touching anything. It's working. Okay. Okay, let's do it like that. So basically, in many fields, there's a spectrum across specialties, where quite often the most quant. So again, economics and social science has the lowest proportion of women. But what's striking to me is when you look at three broad disciplines that have the lowest proportion of women, which are at the bottom. So engineering, there's no spread. In each of the subfields, it's actually quite narrow. Of course, we could say chemical engineering is a bit better, but again, it's really far from the other. So there really is something peculiar happening in those fields, the STEM field, where the proportion of women is actually really problematic. And in many places of the world, actually not increasing at a very fast pace. I'll show some projections later. And if I can give just a real life example, in Quebec at the engineering school in the 1980s and 90s, crazy increase in proportion of women at the undergrad. For 20 years, it's as if there was a ceiling that was reached and that society was to find a way to have more women in those fields. Of course, there's national actually is quite in the high end. Is the highest number of Spain is about 50% around the Paris zone. And what you actually see, I want to go to the math and physics. There's no country where we're actually really doing better. The you see a difference. You see the huge blue bars there. Of course, that has a higher will increase chapter. We're also looking at not only participation but research productivity, which is often an argument to explain some of the differences that are women less average rate. Did was to look at distributions. The Leiden design algorithm. And important. In almost men, the high productivity. If you look at health sciences, much women in the low productivity. Remember that it's actually health. But if you the high, it's predominant in humanity. In engineering, it's quite stable, and same in physics. But there's many fields where you actually see the gap increasing across the productivity rates, where at the end of or where higher productivity, a much higher proportion of men. And you actually see the same in psychology at the bottom. Of course, it's hidden by our little thing here. More women at lower productivity rates, and then it dips, and then higher men. So there really in all fields a gap from a productivity point of view. And then from a from the prediction, this was prediction based on the 13 years of data, trying to see if the slope remains the same, what would it lead us to? And again, for engineering, math, and physics, all breadth, about 150 years to reach a parity at this rate. So again, we're very far. Things are really marginally in those fields. They're really are in a class of their own. From collaboration, trying to get into the context of the research itself. So last time Cassidy presented that looks like a this is basically the author's list of one of these high energy physics papers that has hundreds, if not thousands of papers. So we know, of course, science is increasingly collaborative, and it's been collaborative for. And it's interesting to look at how labor is divided and what collaboration are made and when researchers. Of course, when there's collaboration, sometimes there's disputes. There's arguments about the original result. It's something that we're drawing upon in our interpretations. Is that disputes about both naming, so should they be or not on the paper, should they be first or not authors on the paper, and were there issues about who should be acknowledged. So there's something happening there where the thing that is the most crucial for science right now, which is women, seem to have a bit more struggle than men on that front. We also asked researchers in that survey, what is the thing that they value the most in a collaboration? Of all of the tasks that can be done, and I'll get back to that later, what are those that they give the most, what are also the tasks that they're giving the less value to? And so we're seeing that actually women were giving more value to almost every task than men. So they think that every task is more important, except one, which is technical work, especially in the medical sciences. So women give less value to technical work. And as we'll see later, it's actually that they are the most likely to do, which is a quite who leads the research influences the rest of the team. What this shows is basically the proportion of woman first author, so that's on the x-axis, as a function of who is the last author. So for every discipline, if a woman is last author, so if a woman is the leader of the team, there's going to be a much higher woman in the first authorship. If it's a man as first author, it's actually much less likely. And the difference is actually quite striking, in the order of about 20 percentage points for every discipline. So it kind of suggests that women are more likely to attract other women in their team, that there's some kind of homophily or affinity in terms of collaboration. Another variable that we looked at was national versus international collaboration. And what we see is Switzerland is basically on parity, or close to parity, but for again every more women in collaboration, or again The last set of results that I want to present, and then I will end the presentation to, is on who does what. So increasingly on scientific papers, we have information about division of labor, things actually declared by the authors, quite often by the corresponding author. And this is something that started well, roughly 20, 25, 26 years ago, where the editors of medical journals start to think that we need a new system. Authorship does not provide enough details. We need to move to a system that is in a way closer to movie credits. So who was the director, who was behind the camera, who did the scenario, etc. We need something similar for scientific research. We need to move away from authors and think of scientists as contributors. They contributed to these different tasks. And so some journals started to adopt what's called contributorship statements. It's really important in medicine and the social sciences. We're not there yet, but I believe it's coming. So in a journal like PLOS ONE, you're going to have a list of authors. You're going to have the specific contributions, and then have people who are acknowledged for different things. So there's we can have a look at. I'm going to link here to the contributor statement. We did an analysis, and this is what I'm going to start by presenting, of those authorship contributions, which generate 5 of them. So conception and design of the experiments, performance research, analyzing the data, contributing reagent, which was kind of a varia category, like you did a bit of thing, we're putting you there, and then writing of the paper. And with those, we actually saw huge gender differences. So from an analysis point of view, and the x-axis here is career age, determined by the year to the first publication. So analysis of by men in the early years, then it's kind of even. Design is also more likely to be done by men. The more you age, the more likely you are to contribute this conceptual task. Material also more likely to be done by men. And then the huge gap in performing the experiment. Who actually does the research? And we see that time there's a huge gap between men and women in the percentage of researchers or of authors who are performing the experiment, with women wildly doing it much more. And basically what we estimated is that, because of course as you age you do less of the experiment because you go more into the, let's say, conceptual task, but a woman will do as much experiment as a man who's like 8 years younger in academia. So it kind of shows something that is, one could say, slightly problematic. And then writing of the paper was more likely to be done by men. We also controlled for other factors, and the odds ratio were actually quite high. So basically, women much more likely to doing the performing the experiments, and men more likely to do all of the other tasks. Of course, the first typology was not perfect. And I'll get to that in a couple of seconds. Before that, I just want to say a couple of words on the mean age of author, and this is just a contextual information. So, of course, all of the more conceptual things were done by older authors, and the experiments were done by younger authors, which of course makes sense considering what we saw just earlier. So the community was quite dissatisfied with these 5 categories. We're saying, yeah, that's actually not precise enough. And so there's a group of researchers and of organizations that have developed the credit typology, where basically things are divided into 14 different types of contribution that go from conceptual things, well, data curation, formal analysis, investigation. Investigation here is the equivalent of performing the experiment in the previous one. Development of the methodology. There's a couple of administrative type of contribution, like project administration, supervision, obtaining funding, and then the other very useful division here is between writing the original draft and editing the manuscript. In this category, everything is kind of blended together. And so what do we obtain? Well, we obtain a gap that, again, follows what we would believe with men more likely to do, women more likely to do investigation, which again confirms the previous result obtained, more likely to do data curation, and also women more likely to have written the original draft. In the previous category, where writing was one category, men were more likely to do it. But once you divide who actually does the work of writing the original draft, and that's the main work, women are more likely to do it. And review and editing is kind of on a par, and men are more likely to do all of the resources, funding, and supervision. So again, clear difference. And again, keep in mind of what we saw here in the survey. What is the task that women value the least? Well, it's actually the investigation and the experiment, which is the thing that they are more likely to do. So on that, I'm giving the mic to Cassidy.
Perfect. Thank you. So, as Vincent said, being an author on a publication is critically important, and it leads to a lot of the issues that we see in attention and attrition and retention within science. But another huge one is funding. And as we saw before, men are more likely to do funding acquisition on a paper. So we've dug into this in a couple of different ways. One, using academic analytics, which is a comprehensive data set of funding for the US, and another one using Web of Science, which I'll show later. So when we look through here, the first question is, what is the proportion of people who hold a grant? Not the size of it, but just whether or not you have funding. And when we look at it there, we see a lot more parity. And in many cases, more women hold grants. So in the medical sciences, we see that men are more likely to hold a grant, but in engineering, women are actually much more likely to hold a grant. So this is really exciting news until we dig into the amounts of those grants. And then we see that the mean amount for women is much lower. So even in engineering, though they're likely to have a grant, they have on average much smaller grants than their male counterparts. In other areas, they're a little bit more equal. Now, one question may be how much that is driven by seniority. Are those big grants given to more senior authors in engineering, which are disproportionately likely to be men? So we looked at the year in which people got their PhD, before 1975, between 75 and 85, 85, 95, etc. And what we see in the younger cohorts is there's actually close to parity, men and women receiving grants at about the same rate, but that disparity increases with age. When you get to the younger and younger generations is where you start to see the disparity, which suggests that a lot of attrition is happening. If you don't get a grant, you leave the scientific workforce, only leaving the women who are getting grants at equal rates to their male counterparts within the academic system. Now, of course, this differs by discipline as well. So if we look in the natural sciences, we see parity for the younger cohort as well as the older cohorts. It's not as much of an issue there. But if we look in the medical sciences, we see a massive gap between men and women in that youngest cohort in the proportion holding a grant and in the mean grant dollars, which is shown here, which later we'll show has massive implications for what gets studied within the medical sciences. Now we can take also Web of Science, and using their acknowledgement data, we can look at the proportion of papers that have funding as a proxy for this receipt of grants. Now, of course, this has many caveats, which we can talk through, but it gives us a different lens on the fundedness of research for men and women. And here we start to see some differences. We actually see that women's papers in engineering and mathematics and physics are much more likely to have funding than men's papers in those areas. So we see sort of a reverse tension here. When women are in the minority in a discipline, they're actually more likely to have funding than when they're in the majority, which may again be a selection effect. In order to stay in a field that may not be as receptive to women, you have to be funded and funded at higher rates than your male counterparts. It could also suggest a productivity issue, that you're producing more papers with each of your funding than your male counterparts as well. We see men tend to have more funded papers in chemistry, biomedical research, health, etc. Now, if we start to look at this normalized percentage of papers with funding disclosure, we see interesting patterns in collaboration, with the highest percentage of papers actually for those where we have a senior male author and a younger female author in first authorship role. Those are sort of our dominant thing. And then women's papers, again, tend to have these high rates of fundedness than men, women, and then the least often is actually the men. So there are these productive collaborations that we're seeing of these patterns of more senior men with more junior women. And we'll turn to mobility as well, which is, I know, something that's of interest to this group here, and talk a little bit about it. Now, I always like to feature the voice of women when we're giving talk. Alice Hamilton is shown here, who was a woman who was studying in the 19th century. Now, what we'll see in mobility patterns right now is we like to think about the US as being this huge receiver of scientific capital, of people coming to the US, but that wasn't always the case. In the 19th century, there were no doctorates for women in the United States, so women had to go abroad in order to get their degrees. And I love this quote from Alice. She went to Germany, which many women did, and they were told that the only reason women wanted a university education was to make trouble for the government. So if foreign governments did not object, that was all right, but Germany had more sense. And what it meant by this is Germany would allow foreign women to come and receive doctorates, but not allow German women to at the time. So they would come, educate foreign women, and then send them back to make trouble for their own governments, which I think is a fantastic sort of activity. Now, of course, over time, this has changed a lot. In research that we've done with Nicholas, we looked at the flow pattern of different scientists across space. And what you see is that Europe is often losing a lot of scholars to North America. North America becomes a net flows. But this is different by gender. So when we look at migrants, that is people who publish in one place and then break ties with that and move to another place, we find that men are much more likely to be migrants at every stage of productivity. So what you see on the x-axis there, the number of papers that they have over time. The more productive they get, the larger that gap is in their probability of migration. Now, travelers are those who just grab other affiliations. They never break ties with their home country, but they tend to get an affiliation here, a visiting professorship here, a short stay here. There we see less of a gap, though men are slightly more likely to be travelers than women are. Now, this varies by discipline again. Again, those interesting relationships in which disciplines have higher migration. So overall, physics, humanities, earth and space, and mathematics are just inherently more mobile disciplines. We see more mobility overall for both men and women, but we see some stark differences there. Now, we see a bigger difference in the humanities. And what I would argue is that this is a field where mobility is a luxury, and there we see the gap. In places like Earth and space, we actually see higher mobility among women. But this is a space in which mobility is not a luxury, but an obligation of the discipline. You cannot do this type of research unless you engage in scientific mobility. So just like the funding data, we see that selection effect again. To stay in the discipline, you have to be mobile. And we see that for physics and for earth and space sciences, with larger gaps in the other disciplines where migration isn't a necessarily inherent part of the discipline as well. And across the board, we see in most disciplines more male travelers, except in the humanities where we have more women travelers, and in engineering, again, where women are picking up some of those affiliations without losing ties. There are country differences as well in this mobility, with men more likely to move from many of the places in the global north and in north of Africa, but some places in Central Africa and other countries where women are more likely to leave the country than men are. Now, what I find absolutely fascinating, and we won't be able to piece through all of this, is the gender differences in where people go. So what we have at the top is where you go, the region of your destination, and where you're coming from. So Northern European women go to other European countries. They're not really going to Asia. Western European women, though, may go to Northern Africa. And so we see these kind of spaces here of Southern European we have men going to Asia, women going to Europe, women going to Oceania. So you start to see these sort of spaces that are more receptive or less receptive to men and women across the globe. Now, what does this mean in terms of citation receipt? So Vincent sort of alluded to some of this already when we saw that women's work tends to be more domestic and men's work tends to be more international in terms of collaboration. And that has huge impacts in terms of citation. So the worst thing to do is write a paper with no collaboration, lowest citation impact. Then national collaborations receive more citations and international collaborations receive the highest citations. However, in each and every category, for a woman to be a sole author or a first or a last author in any of those combinations, they receive fewer citations than their male counterparts in those same positions. So this produces a sort of compound disadvantage. First, their work is more likely to be less cited, and they're more likely to be in national rather than international collaborations, which are also less. Now, there are country differences as well. We have the UK. Much bigger gap in your international collaborations between your men and women authors. Well, that's because it's not pushing, just publishing in Science and Nature and PNAS and Cell, they would be fine. So one of the things that we looked at was the average impact factor of the journals in which men and women published and the citations in which they published. So the citations are in red and those journal factors are in green. In many cases, earth and space science, biology, engineering, with high factor than men, and yet they're still cited at lesser degrees. So it's publishing that's driving this. Now you may say, well, you can't use averages because we know that GIFs and citations are highly skewed distributions. So averages are terrible. So we've taken it into deciles of journal impact factor. And if you go into that lowest decile, there's very little difference. And the difference grows and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until you get to that top impact factor journal. It's precisely when women publish in Science, Nature, and PNAS that we observe the biggest gap in their citedness. Now, I would argue that in a highly selective journal, there's quality control. If you are published there, it's high quality. So we can't explain this by women's work being of inherently lower quality. They're simply not being cited at the same rates of men, which suggests a bias in the system. Now, we can also see and break apart some of these averages when we look at the percentile rankings for that non-collaboration, national, and international collaboration. And what we see is when we look at the top most cited in the 1%, 3%, and 10%, we do see some differences. So men tend to be more highly represented among those top percentiles, but we also see pretty strong differences, particularly for the single-authored work, in the uncitedness. The degree of papers that receive no citations is higher. So there is a disadvantage at both ends, being uncited completely and then being in that top cited rank between men and women. Now, a lot of people have argued that these differences are all because men cite themselves a lot, and they cite themselves way more than women do. And now that is true, and we do see some evidence of these. So we see the percentage of self-citations as a function of your total number of citations here. And you do see that that blue bar is higher than that orange bar, but you see a lot of heterogeneity. So even though that there's a difference in these self-citations, it doesn't explain all of the difference that we see in terms of impact. Now, of course, all of this can't just be explained by science. It's easy to say, all right, this is a scientific system. The scientific system is broken, it's biased, it's sexist. But we also know that science exists in a context, in a social context. So one of the places we've looked is other influence that may affect production and science. And so one of those is parenting. So women as caregivers is often given as an explanation for their lower productivity or their lower sightedness. So we did a massive survey of thousands of scientists within the Web of Science. So people who had published a paper. And we asked them to start, are you the lead parent? Do you have primary responsibility for caregiving? Or do you share it equally? Or are you a satellite? Is there someone else who is the lead caregiver? Maybe a partner, but maybe a grandparent, maybe a nanny, maybe someone else who does that. And not surprisingly, women are proportionally likely to be lead parents and men to be satellite. For me, was the women really this is fantastic. So we said, okay, great. How are you doing this sharing? So we'll start by asking you, when do you do the lead parenting? What time of day? Weekdays, 6 a.m., 9 a.m., 9 a.m., 5 a.m., weekends. And women did it more often in every single time period. So we said, okay, well, this is probably because we have a little bit more women in that lead parenting category. So let's break this into lead, dual, and satellite. And now for the very small amount of lead men, say that little green bar up there, we do see that they're taking the lead at most of those times. They're doing that work. But when we come to those shared parents, we're seeing women tend to be doing more of the work. And when women say that they're satellite parents, they're actually doing a whole lot of lead parenting throughout this time. So we said, well, maybe it's not time, it's task, it's really what you do. So we asked these these dual and these satellite parents, what do you do? Who organizes play dates, parties, doctor appointments, snacks, household shopping, holidays, everything we could think of? We threw it all at them. And in every single category, women were more likely to do the task except for one: coaching sporting events. So that's a really important category, and I know it takes a lot of time, but I'm hard pressed to believe that that really constitutes shared parenting. And we even see that in lead parenting, where the men who were doing that lead tended to do some nursery school drop-offs and pickups from school. So drop the kid off on your way to work, pick them up on the way home from work. But that was really what was constituting the majority of their time and their parenting responsibility. Now, one of the beautiful things about this is we also asked about their spouse's occupation. So we were able to see in these if your spouse was also an academic, and we controlled for these academic couples, because one argument is we know that women are more likely to have an academic partner. Men are more likely to have flexible working, who may not be working 40 hours a week. So we wanted to control only those academic households where we could argue that their of how much, and I didn't put this caveat. We did ask about the vast majority were sexual relationships. So what we're going to talk about here is men and women. So we asked the men and women two flipped questions. My partner takes on the majority of childcare, so I can focus on my career. And I take on the majority of childcare, so my partner can focus on their career. And only looking at those shared academic households, we found that both men and women agreed that the women take on the majority of the childcare so that the man can focus on their career, even when they had shared expectations of labor duty. This has huge implications for production and, as we'll see later, for impact. So what we see here is your total production on a log scale for women in red and men in blue. And now lead parenting has a penalty for both men and women. We see that, but a larger penalty for women, who we know are taking on a larger share of the tasks. And in those shared parents, women have a burden and have a lower than average expectation, while men are actually producing higher than average when they stay in these shared parenting roles. The satellite are just on average and starting to exceed beyond that. So what we start to see is that really time is finite, and the more time on parenting, the less time you're spending on production. And we see that penalty here we also look for citations and threw all of our variables into a huge regression and said, all right, what are the things that are going to predict farsightedness? Well, being a man, take a short parental leave, which men do disproportionately. Have your partner coordinate play days. Don't be religious or celebrate any holidays, and travel. The more you're away from your family, the more citations you're going to get. And what's bad for citations? Don't have more than 2 kids. Don't take long parental leaves, which women tend to do. Don't be a primary or equal caregiver. Don't help your kids with extracurriculars. And any variable that suggested you had a child under the age of 5 is really bad for your sightedness. Now, I think this is really important because we often take the myth that citations equate to some sort of quality, and they don't. Citations are an indicator of visibility. And what we show here is that when women have children under the age of 5, they're not as visible. They're not going to conferences, they're not going to talks, they're not on things because they're at home. When you take a long parental leave, you're not visible. When you're a man who's not celebrating holidays and you're traveling a lot, you're highly visible. And that's what all of these indicators show us, that when we make women invisible in the scientific system, they suffer in terms of the reward system of science. So why does this matter? Why does it care? Why do we care, right? And I think this was a comment that came up a lot during the pandemic, right? As children came home in droves and women often left the workforce in order to take care of their children and homeschool children, they said, well, that's good, right? Children need their mother. That's good for society to have women there. So why does it matter whether there's a man or a woman in the lab? Why does it matter whether it's a man or a woman who's discovering the next vaccine? Does that have any implications on what we know? So this is a study that Vincent and I did several years ago where we kind of flipped this around. What we wanted to know was how men and women were incorporated into biomedical studies. Was sex taken into account as an analytic variable? And did we include both male and female subjects in the study? So we look at it for biomedical, clinical, and public health. Now you may say, okay, well, biomedical research isn't taking sex into account, but that's work done on the cellular level. Why does that even matter if you know the sex of the cell from which it was taken? But it matters a lot. We actually know that the degree to which the cells absorb lipids, the responses to stress, matter violently in many of these cases. And what we see is that 8 out of 10 drugs withdrawn from the market are withdrawn because they have adverse effects for women. Why? Because no one ever took sex into account when they were studying these pharmaceutical treatments. Now, in clinical medicine and public health, we're seeing an increase of the inclusion of both sexes in the study. So in clinical medicine, we're often using rodents or other kinds of mouse models in the studies, and in public health, we're using humans. For a long time, people said, well, we can't use women because they have such high variability. You know, with their cycles, we can't test them, and they're going to really violate sort of the research design and principle. Many new studies have shown that men have as much and sometimes greater volatility in their chemical makeup each year as well. And so over the course of these cycles, understanding both men's and women's volatility on their chemical composition is really important, right? So we're starting to take this into account. Now, going back to our study, we said, all right, we took whether they took sex into account, whether they studied males or females, and now we want to know whether those were done by men or women scientists. So first, I'll show sort of what we found here as a validity. Urology, you mostly study men. Makes sense. Gynecology, you mostly study women. Also makes sense. But in physiology, we tend to really study a lot of men. In addictive diseases, we study a lot of men, right? And those have consequences. And we found that when a woman was on the project, it was much more likely to take women into account and to take sex into account overall. And when we had 2 women on the project, both in the first and last author, it was significantly more likely to take sex into account as an analytic variable and to include women in the study. So simply put, when women are doing biomedical research, they're incorporating more women into the study. They know more about women's bodies. And given that women make up, approximately 50% of the population and 100% of the birthing population, that's sort of important. Right? So in a study that we did together with Diego as well, we wanted to extend the role of race and ethnicity with context. And we found very similar things along homophily. When Asian authors were doing work in health, they were more likely to look at issues related to China. When Black authors were doing health, they looked at African Americans, racial disparities. When white women were looking at it, they were more likely to look at education and community. Latinx women were more likely to look at topics related to Mexican, English, Spanish, or the Latinx body and racial disparities. It's again that lived experience. When we diversify the scientific workforce, we ask a broader range of questions that apply to the entire population, to the entire society, and not just that subset of society that is represented by scientists. So we find that strong homophily. And what we did was sort of a back of the envelope calculation to say, if the race and gender distribution of authors looked exactly like the US population, we would have had 29% more articles on public health, 20% more on gender-based violence, 18% more on tropical diseases, and 17% more research on families. And given the pandemic that we've just endured, I think all of those topics would have been really helpful. And if you're going to ask at the expense of what, it would be econ research. So I'll just end with this. Thinking about science and how it should be fit for everyone. And you may look at this dummy and say, why a crash test dummy? Well, women are 17% more likely to die in a car crash than men, and 47% more likely to sustain really serious injuries. Why? Because it wasn't until recent years that we introduced a female-typed crash dummy into crash dummy experiments. And then when we took this woman, how we made her is we took the male model, and then we made her 5 pounds, and we put her in the passenger seat. So if you are a woman above 5 foot, if you weigh more than 100 pounds, if you're driving a car, or heaven forbid, you're pregnant driving a car and above all of those dimensions, then you're non-compliant with the engineering of the car, right? And that puts you at greater risk. And I think we do the same thing in science. We build science around an ideal model. It's an ideal model that has a partner at home doing childcare. It's an ideal model that can work all hours of the day. It's an ideal model who can travel across the world, who has no disabilities, who has no elder care, who has no child care. And that ideal model doesn't match everyone in this room or everyone in society. And that harms what we know in science. So I'll end with that. We have several different recommendations for different stakeholders. I won't read through all of these here, but I hope that we can have a conversation about them. And I think the big takeaway that's important here is this isn't someone else's problem, right? And I think it's very easy for us to say, oh, if only the promotion and tenure system were different. Oh, if only funding were different. Oh, if only publishers were different. If only science communication was different. But it's going to be all of those things. Each of us as scientists, all of the institutions in which we work, the funders who provide resources, the publishers who disseminate our work, and the scientists who amplify it. All of that needs to change in order for us to get to a more equitable system. So I'll thank you and we'll take questions.
So, ¿alguna pregunta? You can ask also online. So one of the questions that we got at the beginning, you don't ask that they can hear me. De los que estáis conectados, ¿alguna pregunta en el chat? So one of the questions we got in the chat earlier was about the the data sources of the first graphs that you saw at the beginning.
Yeah, so it's all science data when it is metrics. Again, Scopus would probably lead to similar results. Of course, Scopus is slightly more national journals, and at least in the case of Quebec, we know that women are more present in national journals. So using a more comprehensive would probably lead to slightly different result and probably a slightly higher proportion of women. Thing with Web of Science is that in many places it's the papers that count, it's the papers that have higher value. So in a way, our results show the gender gap in the science that is the most valued in most places.
Any other questions? Those connected at home here in the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
Because I have not read through all of this, but especially for the case of parenting, which would be the recommendation thing.
Yeah, so one of the things that I find is a lot of times people move to leave as the answer for everything. So during the COVID pandemic, all the universities felt like, okay, we see something, we know it's disproportionately affecting women. What should we do? Well, let's extend their tenure clock. Let's give them leaves of absences. And each of those things lead to that greater invisibility, is pushing them at home longer amounts of time, taking them away from science, extending their durations of vulnerability. I think all of that's really problematic. What I love are institutions which are thinking about how you enable someone to be a parent and a scientist at the same time. So many funding agencies in the United States now have Helping Hands Awards. So when you get your grant, you also get a subsidy on your grant to support childcare activities, to be able to bring your child to conferences, to support having nannies on site at the conferences when you go. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about how we put women into that space. I know there was a pilot program in Canada which tried to create sort of interlocking labs. So you have two labs, you make sure that they are sort of cross-trained so that when one has to go on maternity leave, the other PI can keep your lab running so that the production doesn't stop and you don't have that lag in your pipeline in terms of production, and that you can come back in. I think giving more funding to say, when you go on leave, you get a postdoc for your lab, like having that come in, funding those kinds of things, says we're going to fund you to be a parent scientist, not saying we're going to find more funding to let you be a parent and not a scientist.
Yeah. Just a quick comment on that. So historically in Quebec, we had that in the province, and we had that since the 1980s. So the grant was actually amazing data. And what we were seeing in the data is that early in the career, men and women's mean awards were the same until age 32, which is about the age at which women have their first kid. Men continue to drop, continue to increase. Women totally become stable. And at like 45, women start to increase again, but they increase much lower because they start at So you see this crucial moment where that is why the mesh structure is so important, because it allows for that period for women to actually continue to do research.
And it says there that an idea of vigilance bias in peer review. How could is there any idea how that would be done?
Yeah, so we've had a couple different studies. Sorry, should we have one mic on because I think it's getting some feedback. We've had a couple different studies on this, which shed some interesting light. So one of them, we looked at the eLife publication model, which does consensus peer review. So instead of me sending something to Maria and Diego, getting their reviews back, I read them, and then I send both of those reviews to the author editorial thing. Of them have a conversation and have a dialogue, and then we give one review report back to the author. Now, one of the things that we did is we took that analysis and we tried to look at the composition of that reviewer team, who was on it, and we found this really interesting homophily bias, that when a paper was reviewed by all women, women were much more likely to get accepted. When papers were reviewed by all men, men were more likely to accept it. And we saw that on country lights. Having just one Chinese reviewer increased the probability that a Chinese author would be accepted dramatically. So see the homophily preference. However, probability that homophily is not distributed equally across the population. So if you're a woman, the likelihood you're going to get an all-woman team is really, really low. If you're a man, that's a pretty high probability. What we found is that in gender diverse teams, there was no difference in the acceptance between men and women. So there are little recommendations like that where we can say, put in gender diverse teams in all of these cases. We did a recent study with a funder, and we found actually the opposite case, that men were very harsh on men and to create balance, you see these kinds of bias and artifacts in both directions. So I think that gender diversity is a really important thing. I think also just transparency is a really important thing. Many of these publishers are not providing information on who are the reviewers, who are the editorial staff, and I think that kind of transparency would be really helpful. We've also seen that women editors are much more likely than reviewers. So changing the editorial board structure leads to that cascade effect. You select more reviewers, papers are more likely to be reviewed by women, and you have more balance. All of those things tend to matter.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, very, very quickly. So of course, there's debates right now about open review versus the historical closed review. And of course, the single blind leads to a lot of inequalities where the reviewer will know the authors are, and if it's women, we kind of see different thing. People have been advocating for open way to kind of reduce these biases, but it doesn't seem to work yet. So there be done on that. So right now I would say that it's actually a very complex element that that's not a simple solution to.
There was another question.
Oh, yes, it was following up on your previous comment regarding taking into account trying to become parents and mostly mothers and trying to overcome this by or getting sources, but then to keep on the same, let's say, crazy level. Would it be an idea to actually think about performance relative to opportunities rather than saying, okay, this should be done, let's put on extra resources?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, right? I mean, it's trying to put a Band-Aid on a systemic issue that exists in science. So I'll sort of say two things on that. One, that's also my claim for not doing any extensions of tenure or promotion and other things. I actually don't believe in extending the clock for each of these, but rather to say, we know you took during your 5-year period, but we as scientists should be able to judge how productive you were in these other years. Is that an annual rate of productivity that meets our expectations, and certifying people? So I think that we should be much more contextualized in all of our evaluations. So that's one thing that we should do. The second is changing our P&T processes so that they really honor the correct thing. So honoring productivity itself, just number of products produced, I think is neither good for science, and it's particularly bad for some scientists and women among them. So creating structures where we just say, give me your 3 best publications, and we leave it at that rather than asking for a number of publications and number of citations will serve to, I think, both create a more equitable scientific space, but also will improve science, right? I think that our current measures are actually bad for science itself too. So I think we do need to combat that system as well.
Any other question, comment? No? Well, I was actually going to ask also about the productivity and the parenting. So now we have a case in Spain. It's in the newspapers where you have we have the researcher who publishes 1 paper every 2 days. So there is an endemic thing that goes beyond even, well, gender differences are even exacerbated, but it's this culture to produce. And yeah, probably those kind of solutions, like looking into selection of publications, could reduce that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And and this is something that we've not looked into a lot of details, but I would be quite interested to see whether institutions that have cash for publication policies and stuff like that have a higher gender gap than those where it's more qualitative assessment. In the UK, they moved from a more quantitative REF to a more qualitative REF. Did it lead to less gender gap? And of course, there's other confounding factor, but there's structural. The pressures to publish are, I think, exacerbating the gender gap.
Yeah.
And your Spanish case is interesting because it's also making the news in Canada. So it shows how important it is.
Well, I think, unless there's another question, I think then, well, thank you very much for having the presentation and pick up all. Thank you. I did not remember.
Thanks to you.
Thanks to you.
Thanks to you.
Aquí, muchas gracias. Se lo van a encontrar. Sí, es lo único que voy a hacer.